Happy game day, Seattle hockey fans. We have an update on Yanni Gourde. So, of course, we'll talk about what that update is and if and how it will impact the trade deadline for the Seattle Kraken.
You are Locked On Kraken, your daily podcast on the Seattle Kraken, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Seattle hockey fans. Welcome to another episode of Locked On Kraken, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We're bringing you your favorite team, the Seattle Kraken, every single day. It's the trade deadline week. The deadline is officially on Friday. And of course, we're going to talk about the trade deadline, how it's going to impact the Seattle Kraken. But as we've been talking about on the last handful of episodes, first, perhaps, we need to know the status of Yanni Gourde. And we did get an update from Seattle Kraken head coach Dan Bylsma, and here's what he had to say about Yanni Gourde.
I think we're hearing him right now. Game time for Gordo.
And we're going to hear more from Dan Bylsma in relation to Yanni Gourde. But as you heard right there, Yanni Gourde game time decision. If you've been listening to the last handful of episodes, then you know we've broken down a bunch of different articles from different analysts at different outlets. And Pierre LeBrun was one of those who said that we might get Yanni Gourde back on the ice as of March 4th. Now, if you're keeping count on your calendar, today is Tuesday, March 4th. It's also a game day for the Seattle Kraken. The Seattle Kraken will take on the Minnesota Wild, and we'll talk about some keys to the game, as well as a nice little tribute to Marc-Andre Fleury from one of his former coaches. But today would be the day. And today is the day that we didn't hear about the progression. We weren't talking about red jerseys. We heard from Dan Bylsma. You just heard in that clip, Yanni Gourde, a game time decision. So this could be great for the Seattle Kraken, getting the pepper pot back. And I actually want to show you how great this could potentially be. Right here on the screen, you're seeing a visualization of the Seattle Kraken 5-on-5 offensively with Yanni Gourde. You'll see that the red splotches are particularly good or above the NHL average. Below the NHL average are the blue splotches here. 461 minutes with Yanni Gourde this season. And this is what the Seattle Kraken 5-on-5 offense looks like without the pepper pot. This is 2,543 minutes. And you can see that the splotches are less dark. So the good is less good. The bad is less bad, I guess. But for me, the difference here is about activity, if we're being honest. And so you can see that deep blue right in front of the net is just the Seattle Kraken being below average in a big way when it comes to net front presence. But we're going to talk about that a little bit. But you can see, again, this is for those watching on YouTube. I will explain it a little bit for those who are watching or listening, on audio. So right in front of the net, it's still blue, but there's a little bit more light blue. There's just more activity overall. And this is less minutes with Yanni Gourde. So for me, this kind of seems like, with Yanni Gourde, there's just a lot more movement on the ice. And that's probably because of Yanni himself. You'll see on the right side attacking the net, just outside of the circle. There's a nice little red splotch at the point, which we've seen on the right side, up the middle, and then a little bit in from the point on the left side, and just outside the circle on the left side, we see some splotches on the Yanni Gourde with Yanni Gourde. Without, it's a desert. Lots of white space, which the white space, I should say, indicates where the team is on par with the NHL average. But I just thought that was an interesting thing. Again, for me, the biggest thing here is just activity. Less minutes with Yanni Gourde this season because of his injury. However, the charts you can see the difference. And so Yanni Gourde is a key player for this Seattle Kraken team, including this season. And in a moment, we're going to hear Dan Bylsma talk about, what Yanni Gourde means to this team. And the reason that he's responding to that is because he was asked today about the trade deadline and about the fact that everyone knows that Yanni Gourde is one of the names out there for the Seattle Kraken. We're going to talk about an article once again naming Yanni Gourde, once again naming Brandon Tanev. But again, I wanted to give you that update, and I want you to hear what Dan Bylsma has had to say about Yanni Gourde, and not just this season, but what he's meant for the Seattle franchise. Here's Dan Bylsma after optional morning skate today on Tuesday, March 4th, the day that some experts said we might get Yanni Gourde back on the ice.
He's, in this conversation, I'm just going to go back to the playoffs 2 years ago when he was the guy that, in a large aspect, drew the team into the playoff series and drew them into the fight. And he's the spearhead of the compete and competitiveness and energy and work. That's all of what Yanni brings as a player. And, that's what he does for our group and our team for a long time now.
I mean, that's exactly what Yanni Gourde brings. And again, I think that the data visualizations, this is from hockeyviz.com. I believe that all of what you said, all of what Dan Bylsma said, pulling the team into the fight, being active, being someone who, is going to take charge and take the lead and be all over the ice. We're seeing that in the data visualizations. Again, this is 5-on-5 offense with Yanni Gourde, 5-on-5 offense without Yanni Gourde, without Yanni Gourde, with Yanni Gourde. And so the question was asked because, again, the writing seems to be on the wall. Yanni Gourde very likely to be one of the players, if not the player, that is moved at the trade deadline for the Seattle Kraken. But let's get an update. What are we hearing from experts? Why might the Seattle Kraken move him? Why might we see Yanni Gourde stay with the Seattle Kraken? And also talk a little bit about how the weight of the trade deadline is being perceived and handled by the Seattle Kraken. That's coming up on today's episode of Locked On Kraken. This episode of Locked On Kraken brought to you by our new friends at Wonderful Pistachios. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams, Adam Larson number grams of protein, giving you over 10%, Maddie Beniers percent, of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to keep you feeling fuller longer. Now, I love a good snack that you can pack when you're on the road. I'm a busy gal. I'll be hitting the road again later this week. And whether you are snacking at your desk because you're recording or editing podcasts like me, you're on the road because you just will travel for sports, also like me, or you need a quick protein boost because, hey, who among us doesn't? They are always a great go-to. And for our listeners, we want to let you know that you got to get cracking and get snacking with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. Again, that's wonderfulpistachios.com for your protein fix. Happy snacking. And thanks as always for making Locked On Kraken a part of your daily destination. Erica L. Ayala here, wearing one of my pregame hats. The green seemed to work well before, so we're going to go with it. And I keep wearing these hats, one, because if you've been listening to the show, you know I love hats. I even did a little display, what was that, 1.5 years ago? So any excuse to wear one of my fun hats, I'm going to do. And at least one of you on YouTube commented that you liked my hats. So that's all it takes. I just need a little bit of encouragement to keep going. Jokes aside, maybe I lean more into superstition with this particular show than I thought, but it also makes it fun. Gives me something to anchor, if you will, the episode with. And we know it's a game day. We're going to break down some stats and facts to know, including a little bit of Dan Bylsma reminiscing about Marc-Andre Fleury. As of the time of this recording, we don't know, or at least I don't know, who will suit up for the Minnesota Wild, but it has been announced that Marc-Andre Fleury will be done after this season, and this is his last trip, or the Minnesota Wild's last trip to Seattle this weekend, or excuse me, this season. We will play them later this month, but that will be on the road for us. So we'll do some stick taps for Marc-Andre Fleury. Before we do that, the weight of the trade deadline. We heard Jordan Eberle talk about it a little bit the other day. Dan Bylsma, of course, is being asked a lot about it. He alluded to it the other day. And again, the question or his response regarding Yanni Gourde was because of knowing that Yanni Gourde is one of the players in trade conversations. And so this is what Dan Bylsma had to say about some of the noise, perhaps, the conversation, and how it feels to be at this time of the NHL calendar.
Given the time of the year and the dates on the calendar, it's highlighted for conversation, I'll say. But those things and those conversations are happening all year long, and so it's all year long. Control what you control, focused on how you're playing, focused on how the team's playing, and that's the message to the guys, and that's the message to the group at this particular time. There's a lot, because of the conversations and because of what you might see out there in the world. There's something we're all dealing with, something we're all, I'll say, bothered by. But you really just have to, it's no different than any other time in the year, focused on what you can do, focused on what you can control, and just keep going forward.
So that's the approach. Dan Bylsma trying as much as possible to make the approach the same as it is for all of the season. You focus on what you can control. He did mention, and this has been something that if you've been following the Locked On Kraken show or the Seattle Kraken from the beginning, whether it was the conversations that were had with our first ever captain, Mark Giordano, that seemed like an open conversation. Whether it was recently where I got to ask Ron Francis about the trade and the conversations that he had with Will Borgen before trading him to New York, that then sent Capo Caco to the Seattle Kraken. What Dan Bylsma said there, I don't know that it's unique to the Seattle Kraken, but I can say from my experience covering the team that the Seattle Kraken do make a point to have continuous conversations about the status of the team in relation to some players. We heard that report as well with Alexander Wenberg, even with Matty Beniers, and the ongoing conversations that he allowed his team, his agents and whatnot to handle with the Seattle Kraken, things of that nature, even before he came up to the club, what he was thinking regarding staying at Michigan, competing at the Olympics, being with Team USA in other ways, thinking about worlds and stuff like that. So it does seem that the door is always open. And that likely means that Yanni Gourde, on a day that is Philip Grubauer bobblehead day, and I asked our insiders, I'll ask our listeners as well, do you think we'll see Philip Grubauer? Question of the day, will we see Philip Grubauer tonight in net? Or better question, perhaps, who do you want to see in net against the Minnesota Wild? That'll be our question of the day. Also pinned for those watching and listening on YouTube. You can reply in the comments. But with regard to Yanni Gourde, this is what The Athletic has in an article posted yesterday, Monday, March 3rd, what we're hearing about every NHL team heading into the deadline. And of course, what everyone, including The Athletic, is hearing about the Seattle Kraken is that Yanni Gourde is not only on the verge of a return following his sports hernia, but he, quote, promises to be one of them as far as one of the players on the move. Um, and the article says the Kraken have players to move, and Yanni Gourde is one of them. And what potentially could change things is that if there's a last minute contract extension, um, that could be something, according to this article, that is available to Yanni Gourde, but likely he's on the move. Brandon Tanev is, quote, another rental forward on the block and is almost certain to find a new home. So while Yanni Gourde perhaps can get a contract extension with the Seattle Kraken, seems like the writing is on the wall with Brandon Tanev, as we've discussed on other episodes. This, of course, will be an ongoing conversation with Gourde and his team, as well as Tanev and his team, because both have limitations on where they can be moved, if at all. And so both have been reported to prefer to go to a contender. I mean, right? Who wouldn't? So we'll see what happens there. The article also goes on to say, and again, all 32 teams are involved in this article, so just short little blurbs on each one. Veterans Oliver Bjorkstrand and Jamie Alexiak have a little bit more flexibility, or the Seattle Kraken have a little bit more flexibility with them because they're signed through next season. But, quote, both of their names have made their way through the rumor mill as well. All is basically what we've been talking about the last handful of months here. But again, Yanni Gourde and Brandon Tanev seem to be top of the pile. Yanni, whether it's the injury or the fact that the Seattle Kraken, it seems like, are considering an extension, might be a little bit up in the air, whereas Brandon Tanev almost certain to go. So I can only imagine that we will hear a similar statement, or I hope we'll hear a similar statement from Dan Bylsma with regard to Brandon Tanev and his impact. I think he's been alluding to that, especially, in that tough loss to St. Louis, just what Brandon Tanev has meant to this team. But something else that Dan Bylsma said with respect to Yanni Gourde, I think he's also alluding to that when it comes to another player who we've seen part of the rumor mill, certainly not as much as Alexiak, Bjorkstrand, even Burakovsky, and of course, Yanni Gourde and Brandon Tanev, and that is Eeli Tolvanen. I broke that down several episodes ago, that Eeli Tolvanen, not likely, but could be someone that the Seattle Kraken consider somewhere down the road. But Eeli Tolvanen recently has been a part of, and Dan Bylsma believes is a constant in being one of the players that plays his most aggressive hockey when the Seattle Kraken are strong on the forecheck. Here's what Dan Bylsma had to say first about the importance of getting the puck behind the defense, being able to push and get out on the forecheck, and how that impacts the game of Eeli Tolvanen, who had 2 goals in the most recent Kraken win.
Our puck execution and our puck management in the game allowed us to have a forward game, to have a forechecking game, to get to the offensive zone. And, something that was almost non-existent, zero in the St. Louis game. Last game we saw maybe our best forechecking game, because we put pucks behind their defense, and we were able to put some skating pressure and some physical pressure on their defense and get to the offensive zone. And if you rewatch the tape again, you'll see it like 14 times exactly that we put it right behind their defense and allowed us to get to the forecheck, allowed us to get to a forward game. And the physicality is there when the forechecking is there, and then his game follows. Like, he's a factor. And what did it produce for him in the game? Why did he score? Because it produced an offensive zone puck, and then in and around the cage, both by Oliver on the his goal a great shift and a great example of that. And also for Tovy's tip-in goal was started from a forecheck, started the offensive zone, had extended offensive zone time. You get the low to high and him in and around the net, but Oliver's also in and around the net for that tip-in.
And these are things that I've been telling you for a little while. I told you my favorite line, I believe, to this day of this season, Shane Wright centering Tolvanen and Oliver Bjorkstrand. That low to high that you just heard Dan Bylsma talk about, I literally petitioned for Allison Lucan to break down that goal and did my best to do it on this podcast, even though we're not rights holders, so I can't show you game action unless the Seattle Kraken specifically send it to us. So I did my best with screenshots to show you just how well Eeli Tolvanen, Oliver Bjorkstrand, and Shane Wright play that low to high game in one single sequence. But as you heard from Dan Bylsma, non-existent in the St. Louis game was the difference in the win over the Vancouver Canucks. And so, of course, when we talk about the keys to tonight's game against the Minnesota Wild as the Seattle Kraken wrap up this really short 2-game homestand, I want to see the Seattle Kraken be able to execute in front of the net. You heard it from Dan Bylsma. The forecheck, getting out fast, that activates players like Eeli Tolvanen. I would agree with Dan Bylsma that it also activates players like Oliver Bjorkstrand. They can be a little slippery, as I sometimes say, but it can't be just those two players as the instigators or the initiators, or as Dan Bylsma sometimes says, the aggressors, right? This really takes a team effort and a commitment, because then you can have players like Jaden Schwartz, Capo Caco even, hang out around the net, and Shane Wright to find some dirty goals. And we know that they're pretty good at that. So I teased a little bit of what we'll talk about in our keys to the game here, because I just loved what Dan Bylsma said there, specifically talking about Eeli Tolvanen and what is the best aspects of his game. For me, I don't think we've seen the end of the Tolvanen tenure, if you will, with the Seattle Kraken. That being said, my questions always go to the front office. Can we see this front office latch on to the games that are working and elevate through changes to the roster the opportunity or the chance and the likelihood that this team is going to see that style of play more consistently? That's the big question. And I don't know that we're going to get the answers at the trade deadline, because first what has to happen is some decisions have to be made. Maybe if we send Yanni Gourde, but it sounds like everyone is agreeing that it's not a if, but a where. Where is Brandon Tanev going? What are we getting in return? And similarly with Yanni Gourde, those are the big questions looming. And of course, it has an impact on the team, but just a handful of days, roughly 72 hours, and we'll at least know the answer to the question, what will the Seattle Kraken do at the 2025 trade deadline? Coming up, though, the Seattle Kraken, the task at hand tonight is to take care of the Minnesota Wild. Talked about it yesterday. They are in playoff position in the wild card for the West, specifically for the Central Division. So let's break down what we know about the Minnesota Wild. And again, Dan Bylsma reflecting on Marc-Andre Fleury. And thanks as always for making Locked On Kraken a part of your daily destination. Erica L. Ayala here, your host of Locked On Kraken. We are expecting to get Zame back this week. So Zame and I will tag team a little bit from this game and a few other conversations as we get closer and closer to the trade deadline. But right now, let's talk about Know Thy Enemy. The Seattle Kraken will take on the Minnesota Wild, 7 p.m. Pacific time, puck drop at Climate Pledge Arena. And the overall record, 35-22-4 for the Minnesota Wild. The Seattle Kraken coming in at 26-31-4. The Seattle Kraken are 14-14-4 at home, while the Minnesota Wild are 21-9-3 on the road. Pretty solid road record for the visiting Minnesota team. In their last 10 games, 5-5 for the Wild, 4-5-1 for the Seattle Kraken. The Seattle Kraken, of course, continue to be led by Jared McCann. We've talked a lot about him, including some little blips of trade rumors with regard to Jared McCann. He leads us with 44 points. It's Kaprizov, who's been injured, and Boldy, who lead for the Minnesota Wild, 52 points each. The power play advantage Minnesota at a 19.4% clip. The penalty kill advantage Seattle Kraken at a 76.5% clip. Now, when it comes to those numbers, I would love to see the Seattle Kraken be able to keep this game 5-on-5. Our power play has its moments, but it's not exactly where we want it to be. The consistency isn't there. The power play overall has been good to us, but we've let up a few shorthanded goals, which again is why I prefer that this, and that's of course on the power play, I should say. I would prefer this game because of that in particular be played most, or the majority of this game played 5-on-5. The power play we still have to figure out, but the shorthanded opportunities, they haven't hurt us. They didn't hurt us in that last game per se, but it's just how much does it weigh on this team mentally, emotionally, and of course physically to always have to come back, always have to fight and crawl out of a deficit. And you put yourself in a tough spot when you're giving up shorthanded goals, even if you eventually can get the win. We want to tip the scale. We want the Seattle Kraken to be able to tip the scale and dominate more parts of the game as opposed to having to fight back. We do love that fight. And if and when this team finds themselves back in the playoffs, that is what you need. But having to do that so often in the regular season, not my favorite thing about this Seattle Kraken team. So what are the keys to the game? Well, I think regardless of if we see Philip Grubauer or Joey Decord, my answer with regard to defense remains the same, as in we should play it. We should play defense, okay? Now, I don't want the Seattle Kraken hemmed into their defensive zone, but what that means for me is to be mindful. We've heard Dan Bylsma. I've talked about gap control. We've heard the players talk about gap control. We've heard Jordan Eberle talk about, unfortunately, blown assignments. That can't happen. And whether it's Eberle or Jared McCann, some of those lapses come from a lack of communication. So we have to play defense. And a part of playing solid defense through all three zones comes down to communication. So I'm going to bundle those two together. I want us to play good defense because we're communicating well. All right, there you go. That's key number one. Key number two directly relates to what we talked about already on this episode. And if you want a player like Eeli Tolvanen activated, then we need to be aggressive on the forecheck. And you heard Dan Bylsma, he counted how many times the Seattle Kraken were able to get the puck behind the defense and push the puck low, but also be able to keep possession and then get the puck high again to create different opportunities. Talked about that, right? What, an episode or two ago, having different looks, different attacks. That also goes to what the Seattle Kraken have told Jared McCann, Matty Beniers, and the whole team. The shot volume, yes, the quality, but more so the shot volume has to go up. And the great way to make sure your shot volume goes up is to make sure you have the puck, to possess the puck. And a way you can possess the puck is to be aggressive on the forecheck, hunt the puck in all three zones. If you don't have possession, work hard to gain possession back. And that's a great defensive strategy and tactic because you're not waiting for an attack, you are forcing an attack the other way. And so I want the Seattle Kraken to be aggressive on the forecheck. We talk about the 3 Fs. I haven't talked about it recently, fun, fast, and forechecking, because we haven't really seemed to get the rhythm down. I want us to focus on forechecking. When we're forechecking, I think that demands that we play fast. And when we play fast, we can have fun. But let's start with the first F, okay? Let's start with forechecking. We heard how it impacts a player like Eeli Tolvanen. And by extension, I told you that a strong forecheck is going to also open up the game of Oliver Bjorkstrand and Shane Wright, just to name a few. And then finally, my third key to the game, kind of related to some of the other things, but establishing a net front presence. If we're shooting at volume, if we're forechecking, what in theory should happen, right, is that we're getting at least some of those shots up to deflect off of defensemen in front, and or to be shots that are saved, but then carom, right? Whether it's off the boards, or rebounds in front. The Seattle Kraken need to be in position in deep in the offensive zone to be able to corral that puck, either get second, third attempts up right then, or reset the offense. No one and dones. We want to attack early, often. Pepper the goaltender, but the only way you can do that is to have a net front presence. And we talked about this the other day, the win against Vancouver. A lot of those goals, half of them, came through deflections, bodies in front. You heard Dan Bylsma, even on today's episode, in the clips that I played you, talk about that. He talked about Bjorkstrand and, of course, Eeli Tolvanen. That's what we need to see. You have to establish the net front. Whether it's against Marc-Andre Fleury or whomever, establish the net front, make things difficult for the goaltender, but for the defenseman in that coverage area. Make them uncomfortable, make them focus so much on trying to get Kraken players out of the way that maybe they screen their goaltender, or they're late on the help side or the weak side, the far post, right? That happens to the Kraken all the time. Let's do some of that to other teams, but it creates but it requires movement. And sometimes that's what's missing from this Kraken team. As we close out the show, this is what Dan Bylsma had to say about Marc-Andre Fleury. We don't know for sure if we'll see him in net, but his team will be in Seattle for the last time this regular season. And given that we're not expecting the Kraken to make the playoffs, this will be the last trip, as we are anticipating that this will be the last trip for Marc-Andre Fleury. So here's what Dan Bylsma had to say about the Flower.
Marc-Andre, that would be a very difficult thing to get it down to one story. I mean, practical jokes come to mind, I'll say, and there's a lot of them, from hanging clothes from the rafter, usually for a first-time player or a rookie, which has happened numerous times. Filling a player's car with the bags of popcorn, and I mean filling the car. But for me, it's more just the passion and energy and the work ethic that he brings every day. Is the biggest remembrance. That's extraordinary work ethic with an extraordinary smile wrapped up into it, and that's his calling card. That's who Mark is.
But that's our show. So now it's time to remind you to be kind to yourself, be kind to others. And it's a Seattle Kraken game day, fam. Are y'all excited? I know I am, which means it's time to hold fast, stay true, and loud and proud we say tonight, whether you're at CPA or watching and listening on the radio, let's go Kraken. I'll catch you hopefully wearing that UMA hat on the next episode of Locked on Kraken. Peace out, everybody.